Stagflation, disinflation, or deflation? I think it's a matter of time frame. I think if you look at the 2020s as a whole, it will most likely be a decade of stagflation. And I'm defining that as very weak or negative GDP growth in real terms and high rates of consumer price inflation, 1940s, 1970s. But you have to keep in mind that within that decade, you're going to have periods of disinflation. And you could have periods of flat out deflation. I like to remind everyone that in 1947, the CPI got up to 19.5%. 19.5%. 2-3 years later, it was -3. So we can have wild swings in the CPI within a decade that is overall inflationary. And just look at the CPI in the 1970s. We didn't have outright deflation then, but we definitely had periods of disinflation where the inflation rate or the CPI, although prices were going up, the CPI was coming down. So right now we've got 9.1. So let's just say, for sake of example, the CPI goes down to 5%. Okay, well, prices are still increasing, but they're just increasing at a slower rate, or they're increasing at a lower rate. And so if you look at a decade long, I think it's stagflation. If you look at the next 6 months, Q4, Q1 of 2023, I think you could see some disinflation. If we have a massive black swan event, you could have a month or two of deflation. But the question then becomes, what's the Fed's response? What's the government's response? And if we had some deflation, that would obviously give them the political cover they need to go ahead and deficit spend like they did in 2020 and increase the dollars circulating on the balance sheets of the non-bank entities in the real economy. And obviously, whatever they do is going to most likely decrease our ability to create goods and services. And so if you have a reduction in supply, increased demand, it takes you just right back into the next wave of consumer price inflation. So that's kind of my, I don't want to say prediction, but my base case is long-term stagflation. Short-term, we could see disinflation. We could see flat-out deflation if we get a black swan event. But over the next couple months, I think we're going to still see high rates of inflation potentially going up. I say that because the checking account balance for the average American is still way higher than it was in 2019. So I thought a lot of this artificial aggregate demand had rolled off the balance sheets of the average Joe and Jane, but I was wrong. In fact, I did a video whiteboard on that a couple weeks ago. And for the lower 25% income group, they still have, I think, like 75% higher checking account balances than they had on average, or the median, than they had in 2019. And so, yes, the stimmy checks ran out, but what didn't run out is their mortgage forbearance. That's still a thing, believe it or not. You can still apply for mortgage forbearance. And the other thing that didn't run out is the ability to put the student loan payments on pause. So they don't have to start paying back those student loan payments until September or October of this year. So we tend to get hyper-focused on the stimmy checks and PPP, but let's call it the revenue side of the P&L. But we also need to focus on the expense side of the P&L. And if the government artificially reduces this expense side, well, that's more purchasing power that can go into creating demand for goods and services. And if we don't increase the amount of goods and services we have, which is a very hard thing to do because of how screwed up the supply chains are, and then you layer on top of that high gas prices, that's going to trickle through the entire economy. And you have a setup, in my opinion, where you could still have another month or two of very high CPI and potentially going higher. Then again, I think all of those dollars wear off the balance sheets of the consumer Q4, Q1, Because let's think about this. Even if they have a higher amount of dollars, they're going to draw that down a lot faster than they otherwise would. Why? Because of what we were talking earlier. Their wages have gone down in real terms. They have negative real wages. So, or negative real wage growth, I guess you want to be technical about it. So their wages or purchasing power going down because they're not keeping up with the rate of inflation. So that means even if they have a higher checking account balance, they'll burn through that a lot quicker. And when they do burn through it, they're going to have a lower checking account balance than they did back in 2019. That is very, very bad for the economy. And that probably sets up an environment where you have some disinflation, just because that's such a massive destruction on the demand side of the equation.